And this is addressing to a lot of the issues that are even happening right now, particularly in the U.S., of, Asia. Oh my God, they're so different from us. No, we've known each other forever.
Oh, it's so ridiculous.
And if we know our history...
You're referring to a lot of the attacks on Asian
That's
Americans
right.
going on in the U.S., which is disgusting.
Right. Yes.
And you can totally tie that into, of course, the Black Lives Matter. What's the common factor here? That they're discriminating against anyone who's different. But all of these quote-unquote different people have been with you
forever.
For ages.
We already talked about
It's
that
so ridiculous.
about Africa. This is CNN.
Actually, it's not. Welcome to...
the Fantastically Terrible Podcast.
Episode 20, The Great Eurasian Jam Session.
Today we'll discuss the long relationship between Asia and Europe. We've been trading, marrying, and inspiring each other for millennia. The East is not exotic and strange. They're our neighbors. We just happen to live a little further west down the Silk Road. A good place to start might be with the Silk Road.
Yeah.
Since that's where a lot of the influence went back and forth between Asia and Europe. We can go back to Alexander the Great and how he brought Hellenistic culture all the way to China, India.
Yeah, he made it quite far.
Iran.
Right. And then the ideas that were brought back.
That's
like
exactly
zero.
Right. And Buddhism too.
Buddhism, yeah.
And of course, artwork, very influenced everywhere. We have the Roman Empire, who was obsessed with silk. They thought it was almost magical, the fabric.
Yeah, first there's a legend. I don't know if it's true per se, but the first time they saw silk flags, the Roman legions freaked out because they thought that there was some spirit to it or something.
Right.
And then they realized it's just a material.
Fascinated. So from the Asian side, the Han Dynasty is who developed, and they used trade routes through Central Asia. They linked to the Mediterranean through, I'll just call them the stands, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, into the Persian Empire.
Right.
And they were using it for trading silk, gunpowder, paper, spices, of course, religion, ideas, all of these things that influenced art.
Right.
And then we can get into, I guess, the 13th century with Genghis Khan.
Yes, that's when things really start to really kick off.
The perspective on the Mongol Empire is always quite negative, and they don't really portray it in a full picture.
No, because there's a propaganda he used to have
it's
printed.
Very Western-oriented.
But he would also Genghis would also print a lot of propaganda saying how bad he was too. So
I'm bad.
Yeah, so it's kind of like really hard to decipher now what is...
Well, there is an interesting book called Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Jack Weatherford.
Who's an anthropologist.
That's right. And he tried to go back to some of the actual Mongolian texts.
Well, it's
not just from a Western perspective.
He translated the secret history of the Mongols.
That's right.
And
which they ignored, and it was there. It's not like it didn't exist, but they told the story from the Western perspective. The Mongolian Empire, beginning with Genghis Khan, and of course it went on for a few generations. They're the ones who took over the Silk Road and expanded it to cover a huge, I think it was 7,000 kilometers or over 4,000 miles.
Yeah.
And it went from Russia, Afghanistan,
China,
all the way to Poland.
Yeah.
Was all the Mongolian Empire, more than Alexander the Great, more than the
any other
Roman Empire.
Yeah, it was massive.
And part of why they were very fierce, basically, if you didn't agree to trade with them, they took you out. And they had no problem in wiping out a city. But don't forget, this wasn't just cities that were poor little farm cities. It's cities that at the time were hubs along the trade route.
Right.
And wanted to dominate.
Right.
And at the time of Genghis Khan, there were wars between the Muslims and the Christians.
Yeah, and even within the Christians, there were also wars too.
So the Christians actually didn't mind the Mongolian Empire because as they tried to take over the Silk Route, which was their goal, they took out a lot of these fixed points of trade that were controlled by Islamic cities.
Right. What's really interesting is they used to call him the whip of God. They thought, how is it possible? Because at that time, everyone really believed, if you manage to pull this off, it's because God's on your side.
That's right. If you're that successful over that much terrain, then you got to have God on your side.
And it also has to be understood, too, that it's an empire that spans close to 200 years. So his sons were not him. And his sons had definitely a much crueler streak than he did.
That's right. And there was him, and I guess the other highlight was Kublai Khan.
Kublai, yeah, but he definitely put himself more on the Chinese.
That's right.
Yeah, he was definitely more Chinese. Okay. Fascinating history, though.
If you go to older texts, they do portray him. When they say the whip of God, it's not in a bad way.
No.
And he's even mentioned by Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales, calling him a noble king, an excellent lord, and lack nothing. So he was portrayed as an empire even bigger than the European empires at the time.
Well, they believed that he was going to be Prester John.
Some of them did. That's right.
Yeah, some of them believe it.
Yeah, even John. They have, as they mention in Jack Rutherford points out in his book, the first Franciscan Pope, Nicholas IV. And the Franciscans had the longer relationship with them. Yeah. So all the kings in Europe, they would meet with Genghis Khan, and they would have discussions. And the first discussions between different Christian groups, between Buddhists and Islam, was because they were there visiting the Mongols, and they had people from lots of different religions, and because they were there to visit Genghis Khan, they had to chat and they had to talk to each other. So it was very interesting. They helped facilitate the trade, of course, of silk and paper and gunpowder, but also paper money, the idea of the state over the church, freedom of religion, because under Genghis Khan and the Mongols, lots of different religions.
Including
even his
their
mother
own.
Was like a Nestorian Christian.
And meanwhile, they kept their own too, which was...
They thought religion was personal.
Yeah.
And not mandated by the state. And those, of course, were not followed in Europe. But it introduced that idea. Yeah. Also having diplomatic immunity and some sort of international law. A law that was beyond your borders.
Right. He was able to say, okay, you guys are really good at numbers. He would look at the Muslims and go, wow, you guys are really good at numbers. You guys need to be doing this. He would look over and say, oh, you guys are really good at this. Or when he would take over a city, he'd be like, what do you do? Oh, I'm a carpenter. Don't kill this guy.
Yeah, if you were talented, they...
And craftsmen.
In a good and a bad way. Yeah. They appreciated your art, but they might say, we need you in China. Yeah. Or we need you in wherever. I
was reading, there was a Templar. He was like some sort of smith. He ended up in the Mongolian Empire somewhere.
It could be. They could be. Wow, you're so skilled. Because they wanted that skilled person to teach other people how to do their whatever they're doing, whether it was fabrics or woodworking or engineering. They were big with engineers.
And before him, there wasn't the Mongolian language. He got the Manicheans, today we call them the Uyghurs. And he got them to use their script to create. Before that, they didn't have a written language.
And see, with their language, you start seeing it incorporated into Renaissance art. Yeah. And you start seeing, with the Franciscan art, they depict Francis of Assisi wearing silks. This influenced Asian art, and it influenced Western art. Obviously, St. Francis did not have silk robes.
No, he was definitely one of those low-key kind of guys.
And they also introduced the Asian idea of adding depth and perspective and light to drawing.
Yeah, because back then in Europe...
Very flat. If you look at medieval art, it's very, very flat.
It was called the God's eye perspective. So you would see everything at once. Right?
That's right.
And so...
And the way, of course, the use of textiles.
The conical hats.
Exactly, the conical hats that were used by the Khans. And Mongolian script, you can sometimes see Mongolian script in the Renaissance art as well. They'll use it as a trim. I guess they thought it looked pretty. And they also, I'm guessing,
And
were
what's
trying to
interesting
kiss
is
up
that
to
the
Genghis.
Mongolian ones had a lot of had more feathers. The Europeans didn't have those feathers, so by the time, that's why you get the conical hat with the little, handkerchief thing at the back. More watered down version from the Mongolian princess type thing.
Interesting. So you see a crossover. So nothing is exactly, but it's just like today. There's influence.
There's always a feedback. Culture is
That's right.
feedback between two things, and goes out one way, it comes back a different way, and it's really truly fascinating.
So this has been going on for ages.
Yeah.
And people who think everything was always closed off, no, it wasn't.
It only closed off with the plague.
That's what did it. Like when people say, what happened to the Mongolian Empire? What happened to the Silk Road? The plague.
Yeah.
So the Black Death put the kibosh on international trade.
We've always been communicating. Actually, I saw an article a while back that they were doing an archaeological dig in England. It might have been in London. And they found some bodies. Remains. That's probably a better word. And they did some testing, and they realized that they were Chinese.
Yeah, they found Asian remains in
Roman
ruins in England.
So things were definitely much more cosmopolitan than we actually imagined them to be.
That's right.
And with that, people coming, you have that influence, that art influence. As things, I guess you could think after the plague started to reopen again, but it took a while.
Yeah, it took a very long time to reestablish that. Even today they're trying to revive this idea. China is pushing for a new Silk Road, which they call the Belt and Road Initiative, where they're connecting all of the cities that were in the original Silk Road to reestablish easy and safe trade routes from the Far East all the way to Europe and beyond. Yeah. And I hate saying the Far East. Far from where? Far from Europe. It's so Western centric.
Depends where you're standing. It's east, right?
Yeah, it's ridiculous to use these terms. They really need to update them. But if we're talking about the safety of the road is what's important. And the Romans did protect it when they had their portion. They protected this trade routes. And it really came to its height with the Mongolians and the Pax Mongolica. Okay. And that's where you see the expanse of the Silk Road. They created inns, like state-run inns, called caravanserais. I'm not sure, caravanserais. And sometimes you read about this and you say, oh, along the Silk Road they had caravans and the caravans could stop at inns, but they don't mention they were run by the Mongolians.
Right.
They weren't just there by the merchants.
And keep in mind,
they built bridges. They had trees for shade. It was very safe. And I don't know who the source is, but a lot of people quote this. And a maiden laden with gold could travel it and go unmolested. So you could travel very, very safely across the Silk Road from Europe all the way to the east, and you'd be safe.
I think Marco Polo also.
That's right. At this time in the 1200s, he went all the way to China.
What's also interesting too.
And when he came, he was there for a long time. Wasn't he there for like 20 years?
Yeah, when he came back, he was trying to explain to people paper money, and they thought he was crazy.
He wrote down his adventures, and some people actually discredited him for a long time. But no, it was true.
What kind of got me more curious about it, and I'm going to bring it back to a comics thing, was Hugo Pratt's Corto Maltese. One of my favorite ones is the book on Siberia. And when I was reading about Russia, the Russian story takes place in the 1900s. It was a mishmash of Asian and European. And it reminded me of something a friend of mine who was Mongolian had told me. And I thought, wow, he's a great cartoonist. I got to read this book now.
Like the conspiratorial part in my mind thinks Alexander the Great killed and massacred people. The Romans killed and massacred
Julius
people.
Caesar
Suddenly if he's Asian, it's bad, but it's good when
I mean, the Romans
not.
gave us decimate, to kill every 10th person.
That's right.
I mean, to keep in mind too, the Mongolians weren't that many people.
This was all very intelligent, and having a period of time like this where it was open, and that truly was an economic superhighway. It was free trade like they talk about now.
Yeah, and the factories were in
China.
China.
Hundreds of years ago, they were making things there. All of the stuff they're talking about is nothing new.
Nothing.
And I would argue they did it better back then.
Well,
I think that they don't want to portray it in that way, that it wasn't a Westerner running this very successful superhighway.
There's a great deal of xenophobia. And I think it's been there for a long time because it's very Eurocentric.
Yeah, and I love that things are opening up more. And the more they find that other cultures are older.
Yeah.
India is so much older. Peru is so much older. Mexico is. Japan is. Korea is. I love that they're finding.
Yeah. Now, with this trade, there's influence on art.
As happens throughout history, things go up and things come down. And you have a peak period of trade, exchange of art, exchange of ideas, exchange of goods, and then boom, boom, boom. There's something that brings everything down. And the biggest one was
the Black Death.
They had to shut down trade to keep themselves safe, and we got a little taste of that now with COVID-19. With the Ottoman Empire, they closed off trade to the West in around 1453.
Which was much later from the Black Death.
Yes, that's right. And even later, in the 1600s, in the 1630s, Japan closed its doors to any trade with the West, which was called the Sakoku period.
Except for with the Dutch.
That's true.
It's because they were shoving religion and other things.
That period lasted for 214 years, and it was mainly focused on the Portuguese and the Spanish because they were awful.
Yeah, they were pretty bad.
And we can say that because we are Spanish and Portuguese as well.
Yeah.
And they went there, you did have trade, you did have good things, but then they were also pushing religion, pushing Christianity, pushing slavery.
Yeah, they were selling Japanese slaves.
They were trying to take over, and the Japanese, I think rightfully so, did not want to become a colony.
Right.
And and maybe they're right, looking back.
Maybe.
They thought the only strategy they had was just to kick them all out, and Japan was only forced to open up trade again to the West with the American black ships commanded by Matthew Perry.
Commodore
and they
Perry.
Basically said,
either you open it up or we'll blast it open.
Yeah, we'll blast you open. And they honestly didn't have any choice, and they had to open up their borders again.
What's interesting is that that's how baseball first makes it to Japan. Most people think it was World War II, but it was actually 1853.
Interesting. History goes up and goes down.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're the guy kicking someone, and sometimes you're the guy getting kicked.
With 1853 opening up Japan, all those prints now start making, all the Japanese prints, hokusai, starts to make it into the Western culture.
That's right. So we can go into what they now call the period of Japonisme.
Which is a French term,
That's right, Japonisme. And that was in 1853, Japan's ports opened to the West, and they had their first, in 1867, they had a pavilion at the Paris World's Fair. It was the first time they had a formal exhibition of Japanese art. Because remember, Japan was closed off for over 200 years, so this was all very exotic and completely new to them. And so, of course, it was a huge trend in all things Japanese.
Yeah,
Kimonos,
influenced
wood prints.
Tons of artists and tons of movements.
So this was a huge inspiration for the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists. A big influence, of course, was the woodblock printing from the
ukiyo-e.
And this style gave, again, that illusion of depth which Europeans seem to have a hard time with. Well, the Asians kept trying to tell them, you need some perspective. Japan also introduced more of that Asian aesthetic to drawing from everyday life.
Right.
Scenes that you would see, someone brushing their hair, someone at the river, someone washing clothes, sort of the beauty in everyday life.
Right.
And this completely transformed Impressionists, who were very different in style, but their common element was they rebelled against
the guys with the, please paint me with all the stuff that I own.
That's right. The conventional forms of art. So they took on this natural brushstrokes, and they incorporated that freedom to express yourself.
When the Japanese started to see their art, it started to influence them.
That's exactly right. And the Europeans loved the And the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, they took a lot of inspiration from Hokusai, from Hiroshige, Utamaro,
Right.
a lot of the best artists, especially with the woodblock printing.
Yeah. And actually, Monet's wife was known to wear a kimono.
It was the big thing.
Yeah.
And they interpret it in their own way.
Right.
You think, oh, Degas, the guy who painted ballerinas. The influence from Japan was everyday life. He did them doing up their ballet slippers, them practicing. Like, he's famous for these moments in art where they're in class. And that's completely from the Japanese style.
Right. And he didn't try to copy
No,
the
he
Japanese
didn't.
by saying, okay, I'm
That's
going to try to
right,
paint
that's
someone
right.
in a kimono.
That's right.
He said, hey, you know what? This is a really good idea.
What I like what
Everyday
you're
life,
doing is the everyday life, and I'm going to incorporate that into my style.
and apply it.
And they all did that. Monet, you can see. Actually, I'll have links to as many of these as I can on our website. But Van Gogh, I found, I didn't realize he actually did a Japanese style painting.
Mm-hmm.
And you could see his brushstrokes.
Mm-hmm.
It's very him, but it's a Japanese woman in a kimono. I was like, wow, I'd never seen that before. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Toulouse-Lautrec.
That's right, all of them. Pissarro, Seurat, Gauguin, Renoir, Mary Cassatt, all of them. And another thing, the prints were less expensive. So whether you're in Asia or in France or England, you could afford to have a print in your home.
Right.
So it sort of democratized a little bit having art prints in your home.
Right.
If we take that to the modern day, that's what we have. And in our contexts, it's what we love. We love manga, we love anime, we love manhwa now.
Actually, Hokusai called his stuff manga.
It was called manga. But if you look at how they define it, it was a little bit different. But it was called manga as well.
Which is
But they
interesting.
sort of separate it from modern day manga. Or manga, I'm not sure.
Manga.
And it's very cool because it's nothing new. Like when people are like,
Nothing
oh my
new.
God, there's K-pop everywhere. Nothing new.
Nothing new.
And the Koreans, if you look at Korean art, they've right from the beginning had a blend. They take what they like from the Chinese, from the Japanese, from the West. They're really excellent. And they have been, if you look at their history, it is absolutely Korean. They take what they like from other cultures.
Right.
And
Everybody
make it their
does,
own.
though.
But they're really good at it.
But
They're really good at saying, okay, I'll take this and this and this and creating something new.
And it's that exchange back and forth because now you've created it. Now I'm going to hand it back to you. It's sort of like reggae was influenced by Motown. Reggae then turns around and influences rap.
Right.
And it's this sort of very interesting thing.
When you don't have that,
Yeah.
it's really boring.
Yeah.
Think of Nazi art or Stalinist art.
Well,
Or art that is purposeful and has a propaganda message and has a definite... There's no exchange. They decide this is our look and feel, this is our message. No.
Right.
When you see a culture that's really appealing to other countries, that's what they're doing. They're being new and innovative and putting their own spin on things.
right. And that's what all we ever do is put our spin
It's
on
like
it.
a rap battle, right? Like a jazz,
I look at it
bebop.
I look
you go
at it
back and forth.
as a jazz jam session.
Yeah, that's exactly what
Not
it is.
necessarily a
It's a
battle.
jam session.
Japanese prints also influence people like Picasso. So it goes into the
That's
20th
true.
century.
It doesn't just end.
It just
with the
doesn't end in the
post-impressionists.
1800s.
That's right.
So it continues. And it continues. Like, for me, when I look at a Japanese print, I look at the color, I look at the layout, the composition. There's something very compositional that is like, boom, it's in your face. And if you try to replicate it or you try to come up with your own
And
composition
you
so boldly.
You do see the different storytelling if you see the style of American comics or European bande dessinée or
Manga.
manga from Japan. You do see there is a different style of storytelling. The way they lay out the panels, what they show in the panels, even what their story is about.
Right.
I'll just say in Asia, because I find it's true for everyone there, they are much better at establishing everyday things you do every day.
Yeah.
And they use that to help introduce you to the character and the character's personality and
Right.
the relationship between all the
They
characters.
could be a slob. They could be too nitpicky with their...
Right. They could
it
get a
be,
blade and their mom has to kick them out of bed. And they do it in an interesting way. Stylistically, it's beautiful to look at. but story-wise, it's really good too. And I find the Europeans don't quite get that daily occurrence. They have more of an overall story.
Fantastical.
Yeah, but they don't introduce... Like, tell me how many animes you've watched where the characters are hungry.
Yeah.
Many, right? Many you can think of. It's usually
even my favorite Cowboy Bebop.
There's so many where they mention that they're hungry.
And broke.
Name yes, but that's true. But let's just go with hungry. How many American comics do you have where they talk about they're hungry and they need to get something to eat? And it's not just a transition where after dinner we're going to go meet someone.
Could you imagine Batman saying that?
Yeah, it's just they don't talk about going to the bathroom, eating, being so tired and actually sleeping or waking up in the morning feeling like crap and all that stuff. I really like that about the manhwa and the manga.
I think a lot of it has to do with page count. Because when you have a weekly schedule...
I think it's style.
Like
it's true.
But it's also a weekly schedule like Japan. You can afford to have that more.
Their deadlines are crazy.
They're insane.
Too, and they still incorporate
the story
all those things.
is now longer. When you only have, like, say, the European comics, it's usually 50 or 60 pages a year.
And the book is done. You can tie that almost back to the Middle Ages, where they're trying to put as much as they can into one painting.
Gotta
and
put
then
all
the
the stuff.
Asians are like,
gotta have my dog with the diamond collar.
So they're still trying to squish a lot into a few pages.
The last big connection between Asia and Europe is Hayao Miyazaki and Mobius. Hayao Miyazaki.
I thought you were going to say Akira Kurosawa or something in spaghetti western.
Well, yeah, that there is that, but the last big one, in my view, because to me Mobius was one of the great conceptual designers. He was an imagination.
We mention him a lot.
I love Mobius.
Jean Giraud or Mobius.
Oh, I love him. But knowing that Mobius and Hayao Miyazaki had an exhibition and friends, and Hayao said, had I read his stuff before I started Nausicaa, Nausicaa would look completely different.
Right.
And that is, to me, the quintessential relationship between artists in the East, and I find it silly saying that, artists and artists in the West. And European artists, I've noticed there's always more of a connection to manga, and you can see it in a lot of the work.
Europeans love manga.
They love manga,
and manhwa and all that stuff. Yeah. The one thing I do like about Europe compared to when we lived in the U.S. or Canada, they're really open. If it's good, it's good.
Yeah.
If it's good food, they'll eat it. If it's a good story, they'll read it. That, I think, transcends anything to do with borders.
And I think that goes back to that old, I wouldn't call it a tradition, but a relationship. And I think that relationship gets sort of shoved under the carpet.
Yeah, we need to bring this back. There's always been this relationship there, and it's nothing new, and it's ridiculous to make it sound like an artificial border. I mean, there are cultural differences, of course, but this hard border somehow is like a wall that stops you. Of course it's
And what's crazy is this idea too, and this is addressing to a lot of the issues that are even happening right now, particularly in the U.S., of... Asia, oh my God, they're so different from us. No, we've known each other forever.
Oh, it's so ridiculous.
And if we know our history...
You're referring to a lot of the attacks on Asian Americans going on in the U.S., which is disgusting.
Right. Yes.
And you can totally tie that into, of course, the Black Lives Matter. What's the common factor here? That they're discriminating against anyone who's different. But all of these quote-unquote different people have been with you
forever.
For ages.
We already talked about
about
Africa. And now I thought, we should talk about Asia.
That's right.
And it's always been with us. We've always been with each other. We've been jamming with each other culturally.
It's just like Pete Seeger, tiny boxes.
Tiny boxes. No,
the world is not like that.
It's not like that.
And they keep trying to create it and maintain an illusion. The illusion is the box.
But it comes down to,
it's getting into the Matrix now.
Yeah, it's getting into the Matrix. But what's interesting is that we keep thinking, this is the first time ever. Let's just say we've always been connected. This week's Fantastically Terrible
character or creature is Christopher Pike from Star Trek. He was portrayed by Jeffrey Hunter in the original Star Trek pilot, but left the show after it was initially rejected. So how did they bring him back as a promoted fleet captain? So far, so good. But he's been left paralyzed, disfigured, and unable to speak. Rough. Spock manages to outsmart his superior officers and helps Pike get back to Talos 4, where he can live the rest of his days, unfettered by his natural body. I'm not sure what that means, but you could describe death as a state of being unfettered from your natural body.
You could.
For Pike's sake, I hope not. I'm sure Spock would find that highly illogical. Here's to possibly the only actor in TV history who played a character that was maimed, disfigured, lived multiple timelines and parallel universes, and transcended his physical form, all without showing up on the set. That's it for today. 7Robots Fantastically Terrible podcast is by Miguel Guerra and Susie Diaz. Our theme song is by Susie.
The best way to support our podcast is to leave a review on iTunes. So we've been having people who rate it, which is amazing. But if you leave a review, we'll see your name and we can personally thank you live on the show. For more information on the episode, including links to everything we've referenced, including lots of videos, please visit our website at www.7robots.com/podcast.
For something different, we invite you to read our free comics on Webtoon. Ghost Metal is a series of 100 original horror and sci-fi stories that you should definitely read with the lights on. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.